My name is Jamais Cascio. I am a professional futurist. I'm a distinguished fellow at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, California. I'm the author of the Open the Future blog, and I also was the co-founder of worldchanging.com back in 2003, which for a while was the #1 environmental website out there. So I do a lot of writing and giving public talks on issues around the future in general, but issues around technology and the environment and how society responds to and shapes these different forces. The notion of the Participatory Panopticon, which is really fun to say, is that we're living in a world where increasingly we all carry with us these always on, always networked observation devices that record what's happening to us. Yes, camera phones, but increasingly they're being added on to other technologies as well. And our behavior changes when we can record each other, when we can observe each other. And so it struck me that while there were certainly technical or technological elements and economic elements to this story, the most important part of this story was what does it do to relationships? How does it change how we interact with each other? And not just random people on the street, but like married couples. What happens when everything gets recorded? And so I started playing with that idea, and it's actually been a recurring theme in the talks I've given and the writing that I've done over the years, this notion that as we observe the world, as we document and record the world around us, it affects how we think about the world and how we think about each other. And yes, there is a surveillance element of, are we keeping an eye on each other? And that certainly comes into play. It's definitely a big issue in the political sphere. But we need to remember that it's also a personal issue, something that changes our personal interactions. Well, the funny thing is that lying becomes a much more important tool in this kind of environment, in a world where everything is being documented, where your privacy seemingly goes away because the tools of privacy protection don't work very well, and the companies like Facebook that make money off of your personal information aren't really interested in helping you boost your privacy. The only tool that you have remaining as an individual to control your personal information is lying about it. So what we'll actually start seeing, and we're seeing this already actually, people telling mistruths about themselves in order to throw advertisers off the scent, to control who knows what. So you take people who are on Facebook, who may want to have pictures of themselves up there, they may want to talk about various aspects of their lives. Not all of that will be true. If you know people who are on Facebook, one of the best questions to ask them is, do you give your real birthday? And if you do, why? Because what you'll find is that the younger generations, the younger Facebook users increasingly lie about their birthday. It's a very simple thing, very easy to do, and it gives you an element of control. And so what we're seeing on Facebook, on Twitter, all the other social networks, is a increasing use of misinformation as a way of controlling personal information. It's actually a really great experiment that somebody did a couple of years ago, and it's actually anyone can try it. It's a lot of fun. Change your birthday every month so if your birthday is the 15th of the month, change it to the 15th of that month every month, and see who wishes you happy birthday every month. You'll be surprised at how many people, hopefully not your mother, but how many people will wish you a happy birthday several times a year. The idea here is that what you tell about yourself is going to be interpolated with what the broader systems learn about you. So based on who your friends are, what your travel patterns are, what you've purchased, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea of lying about yourself isn't to try to completely form an alternative version of yourself, but is to pollute the data stream, to make it so that any piece of information is unreliable. Because if you can't really trust any of it, then essentially people have to come to you directly to find out whatever they want to know. The idea is not about hiding, the idea is about control. I want to have more control over my information. If you are a prospective parent, what do you name your child? Do you name give your child a name that is essentially Google unique, That is, you give them that name, and if somebody runs a search on that name, your kid is going to be the one that pops up because nobody else or almost nobody else in the world has that name. That can be really useful. I have a weird name. It's Google unique. That's great advertising. But it means I can never hide. And conversely, if you give your kid a name that is a really common name, the John Smith, the Juan Martinez, if you give them a name that millions of people have, that allows the child, if he or she so desires, to become invisible, or to become, at the very least, partially invisible, to be able to hide better amongst the crowd. Because if you say, well, John Smith did this, well, which John Smith did this? It gives you more control, but it makes it really hard to have a voice above the noise. So that I think is going to be an interesting tension as we look at parental dynamics over the course of the next decade. The idea about privacy is, it's not so much that being visible is intrinsically always risky, and neither is it the case that being hidden is intrinsically always risky. The idea of privacy is about control. Privacy is, when you say I want something to be private, it's not the same as saying I want something to be secret. Secret is essentially, I don't want anybody to know this. Private is, I want to control who knows this. There may be a circle of friends, a circle of colleagues that I'm happy to talk about this particular weird aspect of my life, but I don't want it to be something that's part of the general conversation about me. So privacy is about control. And so I don't think there is anything intrinsically wrong with privacy, because the idea is I want to be able to have a say in who knows what about me. Now, that said, the development of our technologies of observation has become so sophisticated that simply not telling people isn't enough. There was a great MIT research program a couple of years ago that was able to identify who was gay on Facebook, people who chose not to list their orientation, simply on the basis of what networks they were connected to. And not simply, not just, well, they had a lot of gay friends, but really this broader web of interconnections had a very high rate of correlation around orientation. And increasingly we can spot these patterns as our systems become more complex. We can spot these patterns. And so where polluting the data stream comes in is in trying to fool these systems of pattern recognition by adding in networks that you really aren't connected to, but help to push you away from the easy observation. What we'll see is that there will be a lot of debate. And this is a great topic, because what it's essentially saying is there will be politics around this. People will have to decide what they're willing to give up, what they're willing to gain, who they want to associate with. My gut sense is that it's not that there will be the chorus, and I assume you're linking to...
Oh, of course.
Okay. Yeah, it's not just that there'll be the chorus. There will probably be a lot of different ones. And so I'm willing to be part of this particular chorus, but I want the other one to completely disconnect from me. I think what we'll find is that these tools of observation and interconnection can be used to our benefit if we have the opportunity to shape them in the way that we want, and not just let them watch over us unimpeded. So a few years ago at the South by Southwest interactive event, I put together a short audio piece that was essentially my own voice recorded and then manipulated several times over, portraying a scenario of a world where you had this implicitly probably AI-run global network of information and ideas sharing, potentially to the point of being embedded in the head. I mean, a lot of it was left kind of ambiguous, intentionally so. But the thrust of the story that was being told was, it was a conversation between the chorus and a small group of individuals who were deciding whether or not they wanted to break themselves off. And I thought that was actually a really crucial point to have in this narrative, in this constructed scenario, It's not just that, ooh, there's this big scary AI that's watching over everything, but that this is a system that you could choose to disconnect from, and it will let you go. But it wants you to be aware of what the implications are, and the consequences aren't just you can't shop easily. There are social consequences when you have groups of people who expect participation in this group. And this is what's funny is in the years since, where Facebook's become much more prevalent, we see a parallel to that. There are places that will not hire you today in the United States if you don't have a Facebook account, because they can't see what your connections are. And so in that same way, what I was saying with this chorus scenario was, there are going to be parts of the world where you can't interact. They won't trust you because you aren't part of this network. And so it's always fun as a futurist to get it right sometimes, and I think I got it right with that one. And it may not be a scary AI system, but it really is. These networks have become so critical to our lives that the implications of not being part of the network can sometimes be profound. I don't like referring to myself as a futurist, but it's a term that a lot of people recognize. What I do is I try to think in structured ways about the future implications of present-day choices. But that's really a mouthful, and try to turn that into a noun of someone who does that is just really difficult. So I'm willing to go with futurist for now. The idea here is sometimes people who do this for entertainment reasons. That is, they work, either they're novelists or they work in Hollywood to help construct what the future looks like for a particular story. But more often, and in a much more prosaic way, a lot of people do this simply as a way of working with organizations, businesses, governments, etc., to help those organizations think about the future, think about their own possible outcomes beyond just the next 3 months or the next 6 months. Our economic structure in the West, in particular, is driven around, or is constructed around this idea that you have to have returns in a short period of time, especially if you're a public organization. And helping these organizations get away from that really quick mindset, that really short return mindset, can be actually quite rewarding. And I don't just mean financially. I mean in the sense of you're actually working with an organization and getting to see a bigger picture. And it's a lot of fun to help people, help groups, help companies, governments, whatever, see a bigger picture. To understand that the choices that they make today may seem really minor, may seem almost casual, but actually have big implications down the road. And that by learning to recognize the early signs of those implications, you can essentially steer the choices that you're making. You get it gives you a sense of feedback. As a very crude parallel, you may have driven a Prius at some point or another hybrid car. If you ever get a chance to do so, what you'll find is that they all have a real-time readout of what your mileage is, what you're driving, moment by moment, second by second driving mileage. And what you'll very quickly learn is that some driving patterns get better mileage than others. And it's not not the big difference of like going up a hill or something like that. It's simply how much pressure do I put on the accelerator? Do I get close to someone and then back off, or do I try to keep it steady? And what will happen is if you start driving a hybrid for the first time, your mileage will get better over the course of the first month or so of driving. Not because your car's getting better, but because you're getting better. You're getting better at recognizing the feedback. In a very broadly similar sense, as you do more and more of this futures work, you gain a better sense of what the feedback is, to see what if I make a choice today, if I undertake something today, what are the implications? What does that look like, not just 3 months from now, but 3 years from now, 3 decades from now? Diesel engines can take vegetable oil, can run off vegetable oil. Although if you do it without the right modifications, you'll actually hurt the engine because the weight it does to tubing, blah blah blah. But the idea here is that as these kinds of car technologies, and actually my plug-in hybrid is right outside that I drove. These kinds of technologies they're ways of exploring different choices about how do we maintain our day-to-day activities. I need to be able to get places, and in California, Northern California, you have to be able to drive. I need to be able to get places, but I want to do so in a way that reduces my impact. I want to do so in a way that gives me more feedback, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually fascinating. One of my degrees is in evolutionary anthropology. It's fascinating to look at the arc of human evolution. We have a conceit that what makes us human is the fact that we make tools. Well, a lot of animals make tools. A lot of animals make some fairly sophisticated tools, as it turns out. But what makes us what makes us different, isn't so much the tool use. Although, yes, we do make very sophisticated tools. We do have very advanced technologies. What makes us unique is art. And if you look at the course of human history, what you see is about 35, 40, 50,000 years ago, we see the first signs of art, first signs of wall paintings. And that is a really interesting correlation. If you look at the evolutionary biology, there seems to be a correlation with changes in our brain structure. If you look at the geohistory, that actually is not too long after the Lake Toba explosion, the supervolcano explosion that wiped out, in some cases it seems to have wiped out like 90% of all humans on the planet. Massive near extinction of the species. So all of these catalytic events, both internal and external, seem to correlate to the emergence of art. And if you think art, well, art doesn't just mean representational pictures. It means being able to ascribe meaning to something that doesn't have an intrinsically obvious meaning. Being able to construct a narrative and to tell a story that someone who wasn't involved in whatever you're illustrating can come up and see that painting and understand what you mean and get something from it beyond simply, well, that is a splotch of red on the wall that looks like a buffalo. And so if you look at the course of human civilization, the emergence and the development and the evolution of human civilization, it's driven, yes, very much by the tools that we make, but it's also driven by the meaning that we are trying to create. So we have the emergence of religions, we have the emergence of different kinds of social models. All of these are around trying to understand not just the world, but understand each other. So humans are an extraordinarily social animal. One big difference, and this is in some ways a subtle difference, but it's a critical one between humans and chimpanzees: white sclera. The parts of our eyes are white. Chimpanzees, gorillas do not have whites in their eyes. What the argument is, the evolutionary reason we have white sclera is that we can see where we're looking, where others are looking. We can essentially see what others are thinking. And so when we talk about the emergence of human civilization, the evolution of human civilization, we can't just limit it to what's the nifty nuts and bolts, what are the nifty gadgets that we make every generation. It's really, what are the stories that we're telling? One of the laments that we may have as a species is that we're storytelling creatures that have no one to talk to. We talk to each other, sure, but there's no one else out there that we can tell stories to. And so one narrative of what the future could hold for us is the creation not just of other thinking entities, but the creation of someone to listen to us, the creation of someone to talk to. And I think it is a potentially fascinating, disrupting, terrifying arc of our future to think about what are the things that we are making, what are the tools that we're creating that allow us to tell stories in more sophisticated ways, and to allow us to create an audience to listen to. What's really exciting to me when we think ahead about changes in human civilization, the development of machine intelligence, if that happens, the development of radically different human, post-human species, if that happens, is what we're doing is we're actually constructing things that can tell different stories, that can craft narratives about the world, can ascribe meaning to the world in ways that we can't at the moment. And so what I see as the big struggle in human civilization over the 21st century is the struggle between trying to construct these larger meanings, these entities and tools of creating meaning in a world that is increasingly falling apart, in a world where the physical environment is shattering. And so, how can we maintain the health of the planet, maintain the health of our civilization, and give ourselves enough time to build people to listen to? When I talk about the idea of creating other intelligences, things that can listen to us, that tell new stories, I'm not simply talking about the standard singularity trope of we create something that then is better than us and wipes us out. That's boring. And it's really unlikely, actually, for both some very prosaic practical reasons around, really how does something like that uplift itself, but also from the perspective of when we create something new that isn't simply a drop-in replacement for us. One of the great values of human minds is culture. When we think about the future, when we build things, when we make our world, we do so from a diversity of backgrounds, from a variety of different backgrounds that give us different sets of norms, different perspectives on the world. And in some respects, creating a new mind is creating just another perspective on the world. And so I am not one that thinks a smart supercomputer is somehow better than everything. Chances are it's still going to be nowhere near as close to the intelligence of humankind as a civilization. We forget to our detriment that intelligence doesn't just happen in one brain at a time. Intelligence is a collective phenomenon. You learn something, I learn something, she learns something, and we share with each other, we share interpretations with each other, and what we get as a result is going to be greater than what any one of us could get on our own. My thought here is that while the construction of machine intelligence, of novel intelligence, is probably going to be a very good thing, it's not without risk, but those risks aren't simply the emergence of terminators. The risks are more around what kinds of meaning do we ascribe to these new minds. There will be people, and there are people that you and I probably know, who will treat these new invented intelligences, these new minds, as being somehow better, almost worship these things, because they've built up in their heads, so built up in their own minds, this notion that we're going to create godlike intelligences, post-singularity beings that are just beyond anything we can understand, and will be eager to worship them. And they will be very upset that I dare use the word worship, but that's essentially what they're going to be doing. What we need to keep in mind is that these are minds, potentially, as well, and will have failings and have blind spots, and are going to be very interesting. I certainly would look forward to having a conversation with one or several, but I'm not going to expect it to be something angelic. We have, there's the argument that we all have in our brain something, the God spot, something in our brain that seems to respond in a way where we have spiritual feelings. Some of us, it's more pronounced than others. I'm afraid that you're going to have people who, perhaps in their day-to-day lives, don't have much of a stimulation for that particular spot in their brains, will discover this as being something they can suddenly grab onto and feel it as being something that's beyond them, not just in the sense of, well, it has a higher IQ, but in the sense of being a better being. And I think that is arguably the greater risk. Oh, the need for meaning won't go away. The need to construct systems of meaning, that's not going to go away. The twist on that question that I think is a really fascinating question is, if we create intelligences, if we create novel intelligences, what kind of issues of meaning will they have? If you have a computer system, a digital AI, what questions will it have about meaning, the meaning of life? Will there be the digital equivalent of a God spot? Or more to the point, is there a kind of construction of the need for meaning as part of the culture that emerges from or that gets built into this particular system? Will there be something? How will that manifest? How will that play out? Will you have, and that, the Battlestar Galactica thing was interesting in a number of ways, but one of the things I found was most interesting was this notion of these AIs, these robots, trying to understand something that's non-physical. This notion of religion, trying to understand, God as they interpreted it. One of the things that I've written in my past, I did game design with Steve Jackson Games, did a piece for the Transhuman Space science fiction game series, which was, the book was called Toxic Memes, which was basically all about pop culture and religion and cults and the like in a world 100 years hence where there were AIs and uplifted animals and the like. And the most fun for me was really trying to figure out what kinds of weird things would these non-human minds believe, and not in the big sense, not just in the greater what is the meaning of life sense, but kinds of quirks would they have. And if I was to look forward to anything with the development of novel intelligences, is digging through and figuring out and discovering what kinds of weird things would they believe. And that's one of the nice things about the development of novel intelligences, is that it probably won't just be a single model. You'll have ones that will be, their purpose in life is always to accumulate more information. There will be ones their purpose in life, as they articulated it, is to understand different possible outcomes. Running simulation after simulation after simulation. In fact, if Nick Bostrom is right, we're probably living in one of those simulations as it is right now. There will be, assuming these are developed, there will be entities that have a meaning of life that will be very difficult for us to understand because we're coming from a very substrate different, a physically different kind of mind. And that'll be a lot of fun to try to understand, try to figure out what's going on there. The trick is, from a futurist perspective, from a storyteller perspective, is to get away from the boring stereotype tropes of big scary AIs that are essentially our bad impulses made silicon. Because if you look, nearly all of the narratives about what an AI, an unfriendly AI would do, really boil down to this AI is behaving like a bad person. Even if they couch it in the language of, we have no idea what it's doing, or it's behaving in ways that we can't comprehend, it still boils down to it's behaving in a way we can't comprehend that essentially becomes just a bad person. We need to recognize that when we think about the incomprehensible mind, or the hard to comprehend mind, that the results are going to be, the results themselves will be hard to understand. The consequences will be difficult we won't be able to guess ahead of time. This may sound like I'm doing a lot of hand waving at this point, and I am. But what I also think is that the reality of these kinds of constructed intelligences, novel intelligences, is going to be much more complex and bizarre than we're giving them credit for being. Geoengineering, the intentional manipulation of global scale geophysical systems to try to create a particular outcome, used these days to really talk about what we can do to deal with global warming. The research in geoengineering is critical for a few reasons. Probably the most important reason is to know what not to do. Geoengineering, the best analogy that I can see for it is a tourniquet. That is, a tourniquet is a reaction to a massive injury that itself can be injurious. If you tie something around your leg to cut off the blood flow to stop your leg from bleeding out, yes, you'll stop your leg from bleeding out, but you could still lose the leg. It's not a good thing to do. It's an act of desperation. Geoengineering is an act of desperation. We have a much better model for what we should do to avoid the worst problems of global warming, and that boils down to the hard problem of getting rid of carbon emissions, getting rid of anthropogenic carbon emissions. And that's going to take time. It's not going to be cheap, and it's going to change balances of power, of economic and political power. And so there's a lot of resistance to taking the necessary steps that would be the best way to avoid a runaway global warming disaster. Because of that, because there's a very good chance we won't do what we need to do in time, it's important to think about what the other options would be. And among those other options would be doing something to create, essentially, to block some incoming sunlight in order to give us more time to do what we need to do. The danger is that some people will interpret that blocking the incoming, small portion, 2% of the incoming sunlight, as being the solution in and of itself, when it's not. It is merely the stopgap measure. Furthermore, there's a danger of what are the unintended consequences. If you stop 2% of incoming sunlight, that doesn't just make things a little bit cooler. What that does is it changes wind patterns, changes rainfall patterns, changes everything that we can imagine about how the climate functions, so that places that may historically have been receiving plenty of rainfall suddenly get hit by droughts. Rainfall, monsoonal rain patterns shift in terms of when they hit. What that means is that you do something that you're trying to avoid a massive global disaster may still make things worse for some parts of the world. Furthermore, you want to stop a global disaster? Well, what you're doing is trying to cool things down a little bit. How far do you cool it down? Do you cool it down in a way? Do the Russians say, well, you only cool it down a little bit because we like being able to grow things in Siberia? Do the Indians say you got to cool it down a lot because we're burning up here? So who controls the thermostat? Who's liable if something goes wrong? And remember, because this is a complex system, you won't be able to make an easy A to B connection between some act of geoengineering and some particular result. What will happen is the normal kinds of weather disasters and climate disasters that have already been happening for centuries, those will continue to happen, but because now somebody is engaging in geoengineering, everyone will blame that actor. The US, Nathan Myhrvold, whoever, whatever. So how do you deal with that question? And I think in many ways the most important part is, what if it goes wrong? What do you do if it goes wrong? You're trying to put that tourniquet on the leg and you put it on the wrong leg, or you're trying to put that tourniquet on and you tie it so tight your leg actually make the bleeding worse. Whatever the analogy is, if you engage in a kind of geoengineering practice that you think is going to do something generally positive, and it actually makes things worse, how do you grapple with that? Geoengineering, we need to be able to understand how it works, the dangers associated with it, what kinds of surprising results we may face, because desperate people do desperate things. If we're in a situation where global warming has accelerated so much, we're seeing permafrost melting and methane going into the atmosphere and accelerating the warming further, we have to do something, because if we do nothing, billions will die. Which is a plausible, if by no means welcome, scenario. People are going to want to do something, anything. If anything is better than what we have now, we got to do, we're going to try it. And so in a situation where we have runaway global warming, you will see people trying some measure of geoengineering. Whether or not it's successful is still an open question. Now, here's the really difficult part. Climate systems do not respond quickly. There are things, the term is thermal inertia in the oceans, in the atmosphere. The warming that we are experiencing now, the sea level increases associated with that, all of the different things that we characterize as being part of global warming today, are in many ways the result of carbon we put into the atmosphere decades ago. We could stop putting any carbon into the atmosphere right now. Suddenly, magically, no more artificial carbon emissions. We would still see decades of warming based on the energy and the carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And so, if we were to experience runaway global warming 10 years from now, it's not because we've done something, we did something 10 years from now that caused it to happen. It's because of something that happened 10 years ago. So we may already be locked into a runaway global warming scenario now. So the difficult thing for a lot of environmentalists, people who are really tend to be very resistant to the idea of even talking about geoengineering, is the question they can't answer is, what if it's already too late? The question that they can't answer, and I've pushed people who really consider themselves deep green environmentalists, push them on this, is what if it's already too late? The reaction is all too often essentially, well then we're dead. And it's not just giving up, it's actually almost we're dead and we deserved it. And I'm not so willing to write off billions of people. I'm willing to research the tools that we may need to save lives, not to solve the problem, but to avoid the worst possible disasters, giving us more time to solve the problems in the way that we would need to solve them. I'm not here saying geoengineering is the way to go. There we go. I'm here saying that we need to study it, because some people will believe that geoengineering is the way to go, even if that's a premature conclusion. And some people will be so desperate as to be willing to try anything. We need to know what to do. More importantly, we need to know what definitely not to do. So Viridian was the Viridian Green movement, something started by Bruce Sterling back in the late 90s. Right. It was his idea to try to structure a green movement, environmental movement that was technologically and culturally aware in a way that the traditional 1970s, 1980s green movements weren't. Well, he was successful. He actually Bruce wrote a letter, to the group in the early 2000s, I think actually in 2000, saying, okay, I'm done with this, not because there's no point in this anymore, but because this has been taken up, this mantle has been taken up. You can say the same thing about World Changing. So worldchanging.com, Alex Steffen and I started it in 2003, and it shut its doors a couple of years ago. There's still some talk about it being reopened under a different organizer. But the reality is, it shut its doors not just because, well, there was no funding for it. It shut its doors because the story that it was telling, the story that we were trying to tell with World Changing, had become the story that the internet-enabled environmental movement had taken up. When we started World Changing, there was no Grist or Tree Hugger or all these different kinds of sites that have really embraced this notion of smart, culturally conscious, technologically welcoming environmentalism. Solutions-focused environmentalism. And that has become the language of the movement. And so it didn't end, World Changing didn't end because we were unsuccessful. It ended because we were successful. And the same thing with that Bruce and the Viridian movement. It didn't end because the cause was lost. It ended because the cause had won. And you're smart enough to say, okay, we won. I did what I set out to do. Now let's move on to think about something else, a different kind of activity, different kind of issue. And so one of the reasons that ultimately I have hope about the future is because these kinds of ideas have been embraced. There are people out there who are willing, eager, and excited about the idea of changing the world for the better. That's a good thing. Well, so here's the thing. We use this term technology, and it actually what we mean by it socially or the connotation isn't identical to its denotation, it's identical to the technical meaning of the term. When we say technology, we're often talking about things that are relatively new. Technology is anything invented after I turned 13. That's technology. Anything before that, that's not technology. So when people have a reluctance to use technology to carry out something, that's positive, it's not that they're opposed to any use of anything that we would technically describe as technological. It's the idea of taking something up that is not necessarily well tested, taking something that isn't necessarily very functional or has compromises in ways that aren't useful, and trying to apply that. Am I going to? One of the big proponents of doing research into and potentially deploying geoengineering is a guy named Nathan Myhrvold, who, among his things that he'd done in his past, was chief scientist of Microsoft when it was developing Windows NT. So the question is, do you really want the people who designed Windows to be the ones running the global climate? And so when people talk about the idea of being afraid that are we using technology, we shouldn't use technology to do these things, it's not because, for most people, it's not because they are afraid of anything technological, ooh, scary. It's because they know what their day-to-day technological experience is like. They know what it's like to have a cell phone that just, goddammit, can't pick up a signal. They know what it's like when suddenly the memory card crashes on their camera. They know what it's like when these day-to-day annoyances of our technological world manifest. And they understand that when you take this small problem and you expand it to the scale of a very brittle global system, it's not necessarily the right option. And you want to pay a lot of attention to testing. You want to give a lot of attention to alternatives before you take something that could, adopt something that could break everything.